open this. Tonight is different. Once a month I open an older chest of stories, ones that found their way here before many of you did. Tonight, 3 tales of things that wait. A tenant who never left, a photograph that watches, and a clock that knows which days need it most. Settle in. Some things have been waiting a very long time for you to arrive. A woman moved into a second-floor apartment in an older residential building. The apartment was reasonably priced, well located. She had checked it carefully before signing the lease. Nothing unusual about it beyond the slight mustiness of a space that had been empty for some weeks between tenants. She settled in, unpacked, made the apartment her own in the practical ways of someone who moves regularly and knows how to establish themselves in a new space efficiently. The first piece of mail arrived for the previous tenant within her first week. A name she did not recognize on an envelope addressed to her apartment. She set it aside to forward, then received another, then another. She asked the building manager for a forwarding address for the previous tenant. The manager was quiet for a moment, then said there was no forwarding address, that the previous tenant had died in the apartment approximately 3 years earlier. She processed this information, asked how many tenants had been in the apartment since then. The manager said 6. She asked how long each had stayed. The manager said none had stayed longer than 2 months. She asked why. The manager said they had all given various reasons for leaving, but that when pressed, most had mentioned 2 things. Mail continuing to arrive for the deceased tenant regardless of redirections attempted, and a persistent feeling of being watched by someone whose presence they could not account for. If these stories have found their way to you, if you find yourself returning to this quiet room, there is something small you can do, like and subscribe. It tells me, and whatever else watches from this room, that you were here, and that you intend to find your way back. She stayed longer than 2 months. She told me this with a slight emphasis that suggested she considered it an achievement worth noting. She had decided early on to treat the situation practically rather than emotionally. The mail she collected and placed in a specific spot near the door. She did not forward it, did not throw it away, simply acknowledged it. The feeling of being watched she addressed directly one evening by speaking aloud to the apartment. Not dramatically, simply stating clearly that she understood the previous tenant had lived there, that she respected that she intended to take good care of the space, that she hoped they could arrive at a workable arrangement. I wonder, have you ever lived somewhere and felt that the previous occupant had never quite left? A presence in the rooms, something in the quality of the silence, perhaps mail arriving for someone who should no longer need it. If you have a story of your own, this quiet room has space for your experiences too. Granny is always listening. The mail continued. The feeling of being watched did not entirely resolve. but it changed quality somewhat after her one-sided conversation, became less like surveillance and more like the awareness of another presence in the space, something that had heard her, that had registered her acknowledgement, and had adjusted slightly in response, not warmly exactly, but without hostility. The particular quality of something that has decided to tolerate a new occupant who has shown appropriate respect. She told me she had learned to move through the apartment in a way that acknowledged the shared occupancy, not loudly, simply with the quiet consideration of someone living with a flatmate who prefers not to be disturbed. Shak koi. That arrangement, she said, cold but functional. She stayed for 14 months, left when her circumstances changed rather than because of anything in the apartment. On her last evening, she spoke to the space again, said she was leaving, that she had enjoyed living there, that she hoped the next tenant would be considerate. She left the accumulated mail in its spot near the door, neatly arranged, a small acknowledgement of the correspondence that had arrived throughout her tenancy for someone who could no longer receive it in the ordinary sense. The building manager told her afterward that the apartment's next tenant had stayed for 11 months, the longest tenure since the previous tenant's death. She said she hoped her farewell conversation had contributed something to that. I think about what it means to be attached to a place. Most people leave their homes when the ordinary reasons for leaving present themselves. Employment, relationships, circumstances, the practical logic of a life moving through different spaces over time. But some people develop an attachment to a particular address that the ordinary logic of leaving cannot entirely resolve. That persists after the practical reasons for being there have concluded, in the mail that keeps arriving, in the particular awareness of a presence that has not accepted the change of occupancy, and occasionally, when a new tenant acknowledges that presence with honesty and respect, the attachment softens, not enough to dissolve, but enough to share, quietly, in the particular way of something that simply cannot bring itself to leave a place it loved. Another whispered story from Japan, shared quietly here beside the kotatsu. If you move into an apartment and begin receiving mail for a previous tenant who died there, do not simply discard it. Place it somewhere specific, acknowledge it, and if the feeling of being watched develops, speak to the apartment. Not dramatically. Simply state your presence, your intentions, your respect for whoever lived there before you, because the previous tenant may still consider the address theirs in whatever sense addresses can be considered by those who are no longer living at them in the ordinary way. And a new occupant who acknowledges this honestly, who treats the shared occupancy with appropriate consideration, may find the arrangement more workable than the 6 tenants who left within 2 months, who never thought to simply introduce themselves. You are still here. Good. Some stories need a witness all the way to the end. I wonder, how carefully have you looked at the photographs in your own home tonight? He noticed her on the first evening, A framed photograph on the mantel, an unfamiliar woman, older photograph looking slightly to her left. He paid it no particular attention. House-sitters don't examine other people's photographs too closely. It isn't polite. But on the third night something made him look again. She was looking to her right. He was certain she had been looking left when he arrived. He began checking twice daily, and the pattern that emerged was not something misremembering could account for. She was looking consistently toward wherever he had been spending the most time. She had been doing this since the first night. He had simply taken 6 days to notice he was being watched. And by then, whatever was watching had already been watching long enough to know everything it needed to know about him. A man was house-sitting for a friend for 10 days while the friend traveled abroad. The house was comfortable, well-maintained. He settled in without difficulty. The photograph on the mantel in the main room he noticed on his first evening. A framed photograph of a woman he did not recognize. Older photograph. The quality and style of it suggesting it was some decades old. The woman in it looking slightly to her left, away from the center of the room. He noted it with mild curiosity and went about his evening without further thought. He cooked, read, went to bed at a reasonable hour, did not think about the photograph again until the third night. On the third evening, he passed the mantel, and something made him look at the photograph more carefully. The woman was looking to her right now. He was fairly certain she had been looking left when he arrived. He checked his memory carefully. He had noticed her specifically on the first evening because of the slight leftward angle of her gaze. He was now looking at a photograph of the same woman looking in the opposite direction. He told himself he had misremembered, took a photograph of the mantel on his phone, went to bed. In the morning, he compared his phone photograph to the framed one. She was looking left in his phone photograph, looking right when he checked the mantel directly. He began checking twice daily. If these stories have found their way to you, if you find yourself returning to this quiet room, there is something small you can do, like and subscribe. It tells me, and whatever else watches from this room, that you were here, and that you intend to find your way back. The pattern that emerged was specific and deeply unsettling. The woman consistently looked toward whichever room he had been spending the most time in. Study, kitchen, bedroom, always accurate, always updated between his checks. By day 7, he was no longer questioning whether it was happening. He was questioning what it meant that it was happening. And something else had begun. Small things moved in the house overnight, not dramatically. A chair slightly repositioned, a kitchen drawer left open that he was certain he had closed. His phone moved from where he had left it charging, the particular quality of someone going through a space carefully while its occupant slept. "Shock koi," he said. Not the cold of fear anymore. Something worse. The cold of understanding that whatever was in that photograph had not been simply watching. It had been learning. On the 9th night, he woke at 2 a.m. again. The bedroom door was open. He was certain he had locked it. He lay completely still in the dark and listened. The house was silent, but the silence had a quality he had not experienced in the first week, the quality of a silence that is being maintained, rather than simply existing. He got up, checked every room, nothing visibly wrong, nothing moved that he could identify, simply the house and the photograph on the mantle, the woman in it looking directly at his bedroom door. From across the house, in the dark. He packed his bag that night, sent his friend a message saying a family matter required him to leave early. He did not mention the photograph. He did not know how. He asked his friend about the photograph when they returned, described the woman. His friend's expression changed in a way he found difficult to read. Said there was no photograph of a woman on the mantle, had never been one. He turned to show his friend what he meant. The mantle held the objects he remembered from his arrival. No photograph. He stood very still. His friend asked if he was all right. He said yes, he was not. He has not been entirely all right since. He told me he still checks his bedroom door at night, makes certain it is locked. He could not explain why exactly, simply that the habit had settled into him during those 9 days. The particular habit of someone who has understood that a locked door may not be sufficient, but is better than nothing. I think about what it means to be studied rather than simply watched. Most of us move through our days with the comfortable assumption that our habits and routines belong to us, that the particular way we occupy a space is private, known only to ourselves. But occasionally something develops an interest in a specific person, watches them, learns them, notes which room they spend their evenings in, which door they lock before sleeping, what time they wake in the night, and what they do in the moments between waking and understanding that something in the room has changed. The woman in the photograph was not simply watching, she was cataloging, with the patient attention of something that had been doing this for a very long time, and had found in this particular house-sitter something worth knowing completely. Another whispered story from Japan, shared quietly here beside the kotatsu. If you are house-sitting and you notice a photograph of an unfamiliar face on the mantle, leave the house. Do not document it. Do not try to understand the pattern. Simply leave, because by the time you have noticed the watching has already been going on long enough to know your habits, your routines, which room you spend your evenings in, what time you wake in the night, and what expression crosses your face in the moment between waking and understanding that your bedroom door, which you locked before sleeping, is standing open. Something learned all of this about him in 9 days. It did not need 10. And whatever it intended to do with everything it had learned, he left before finding out. He considers this the best decision he has ever made, and he is still not entirely certain it was enough. A stopped clock is right twice a day. Everyone knows this. But no one sits down and actually checks. No one keeps a log of the dates and what kind of day each one was when a stopped clock happened to show the correct time. This man did, and what he found in that log was not random. The clock was right most often on the hardest days, the days that needed something, and when he went back through his father's belongings looking for any explanation, he found one in something his mother remembered his father saying on the very last day of his life. I think a man kept his late father's clock on the wall of his study, more out of sentiment than function. It had stopped years before his father's death. The mechanism worn out, never repaired, simply left where it had always hung, hands frozen at 4:47. He didn't think about it much. It was just there, the way old things are just there in houses. Until one afternoon he glanced up from his desk, glanced at the clock out of habit, and then glanced at his phone. And the clock said 4:47. And his phone said 4:47. He noted it, mildly amused, and went back to work. The next day, at some point, he glanced up again. 4:47 on the clock, 4:47 on his phone. He started paying attention. Over the following weeks, he found that the clock, stopped, hands fixed at 4:47, was correct considerably more often than chance would allow. Not every day, but often. He started keeping a small log, almost as a joke at first, the date, and whether the clock had been right that day, meaning whether he had happened to glance at it during the minute the real time also read 4:47. After a month, the pattern in the log was clear. The clock was right on roughly a third of the days he checked, far more than twice in 24 hours, far more than coincidence. He couldn't explain it. The mechanism was, he confirmed by opening the back, completely non-functional. Gears seized, frozen in place. If these stories have found their way to you, if you find yourself returning to this quiet room, there is something small you can do, like and subscribe. It tells me, and whatever else watches from this room, that you were here, and that you intend to find your way back. He kept the log for several more months and eventually noticed something he had not been looking for. He went back through the dates, the days the clock had been right, 4:47 matching 4:47, and cross-referenced them almost idly against his own calendar. The days the clock was right were not random with respect to his life. They clustered unmistakably around certain kinds of days. The day he'd had a difficult conversation with his brother. The day he'd received bad news about a friend. The day 6 weeks in that he'd sat in this same study and cried for the first time since the funeral. For reasons he hadn't entirely understood at the time. The clock had been right that day, too. 4:47. Both times. I wonder, have you ever noticed a pattern in something that should have had no pattern at all? A broken thing that seemed to know when you needed it most? Perhaps someone you lost left something behind that still finds ways to reach you. Granny is always listening. He sat with this for a long time. 4:47 had no significance he could identify. Not a birthday, not an anniversary, nothing he could find in any record. He asked his mother carefully if the time meant anything. She thought about it and said she didn't know. But she remembered now that he mentioned it that the clock had stopped at 4:47 sometime in the last year of his father's life, and that his father had more than once in that last year glanced up at it and said, quietly, almost to himself, "Still right." She had never asked what he meant. Shock coy, he told me. Not because of the clock, because of what his mother said next, that his father had said it, still right, on the day he died. The man didn't get rid of the clock. He kept the log too, though he checked it less obsessively after that. Not from fear, he said, but from something closer to respect. He told me that on the days the clock was right, and he could usually tell now almost before he checked, because those days had a particular quality to them, a kind of weight. He found himself, without really deciding to, sitting in the study a little longer, not doing anything, just sitting near the clock on the difficult days. He said it helped. He couldn't explain why, and had stopped trying to. I think about the saying, "A broken clock is right twice a day," and how it assumes the rightness is meaningless, just arithmetic, just the blind overlap of a fixed point and a moving one. But I think about a man who, in the last year of his life, looked up at a clock that had stopped working and said quietly, "Still right," as if the stopping and the rightness meant something to him that he never explained to anyone. And I think about that same clock years later, finding its way to right, most often on the hardest days of his son's life, as if something about 4:47 had become attached, somehow, to the difficult moments and had simply kept showing up for them. Some things keep showing up long after the mechanism that should carry them has stopped. Another whispered story from Japan, shared quietly here beside the kotatsu. If you have an old stopped clock in your home, something that belonged to someone, that you've kept more from sentiment than anything else, pay attention to it. Not constantly, just notice sometimes what time it shows and what kind of day it is when you notice. Most days it will mean nothing. It's a stopped clock, but if you find over time that it tends to be right, really right, matching the actual time, on a particular kind of day, on the hard days, the days that need something, don't get rid of it. Sit near it a while on those days. You may not be able to explain why it helps, but some things, it seems, find a way to keep showing up for the people who need them, even after the mechanism that should carry them has long since stopped. 3 tales, one evening, beside the kotatsu. If tonight was a longer visit than usual, I hope it was worth the time. If these stories stayed with you, if the dark or the shadow feels a little closer tonight, you know where to find me. I am always here beside the kotatsu, watching, waiting, and if you wish others to find their way here too, there is something small you can do, like and subscribe. I would not object. And if you have a story of your own, this quiet room has space for your experiences too. Granny is always listening, and I'll see you tomorrow for something shorter.